Welcome Home Hal by Bess Reader Aldrich. The last school bell rang throatily, and Judith March, leaving her desk, stepped to the hallway of room 3 as quickly as though she were a robot connected by some mysterious wiring with the mechanism of the unseen clapper. This quick response to duty may have been very creditable to her as a teacher, but when that immediate reaction to the sound of a noisy brass summons has been going on steadily for 8 years, it might, forsooth, also be termed monotonous. Miss March of the 3rd grade was pretty and dainty, and a stranger would have said very young. But when one is teaching in the town of one's nativity, and a small town at that, one's age is neither a matter of mystery nor of speculation. So there was not an old woman in Mayville who did not remember the blizzard of the specific year and month in which Judith March was born. Not a parent of her pupils, but could say glibly, Judith March is 29 years old, for she was 17 the year she graduated, and she graduated in the class of 22. Verily, to abide permanently in the land of one's fathers has its pains and its penalties. The children came trooping into the hall now for the afternoon session with the same characteristic entrance that all those other 7 sets of pupils had affected since Judith started teaching, the first class of which was now in their 2nd-year high school age, and engaged at this particular moment in straggling up the long stairs to its study hall. If the grade 3 teacher looked so different to them than she had when they were in her room, it was because of the truthfulness of the fact that her soft brown hair lay in just as attractive shining waves. Her wide blue eyes looked as merrily as ever, and the texture of her skin remained as delicately pink. Those present 3rd grade pupils, having hung up their wraps, were passing into the schoolroom now, the girls first with that pious air of desiring to get right to work, which is a wholly feminine one. The boys depositing their baseball bats noisily and dragging their heavy, thick-soled shoes in that quarry slave at night, scourged to the dungeon attitude, which is wholly masculine. Judith sent Red Murray back into the hall to brush his wildly upstanding carrot locks. This performance having become a ceremonial part of every school session, as one might always open services with a litany. Red returned almost immediately, his hair showing a faint suggestion of having made the hasty acquaintance of either a toothless comb or a garden rake, and thus rendered obeisance to the god of appearance. Near the front entrance, Emil, the janitor, who had been shoveling coal, stood ready to sound the tardy gong, like a grimy St. Peter about to close the pearly gates. From the far end of the main hall, her face red with her exertions, a little girl came running breathlessly. She was Ruth Jean Edmonston, the child of Judith's girlhood chum. "Miss Marsh!" Ruth Jean was obliged to use the formal name at school, although her teacher was merely Judith to the family. "Miss Marsh, I was so scared I was going to be tardy. Daddy was late getting home, and he had a letter he was reading to Mother, and I waited a few minutes to hear it. Miss Marsh, you're never going to guess. We're going to have company Saturday and Sunday. Important company from New York. Miss Marsh, he's a Mr. Hal Denning from New York. He's a cartoonist from New York. Daddy says in New York." Well, Ruth Jean could not have known it, of course, if she had brought one of the baseball bats from the end of the hall and struck Miss Marsh a smashing blow between the eyes. The result would have been both surprising and painful, but not more devastating. Miss Marsh looked at the child with the same blank expression she might have used had the bat done its deadly work. Then a tidal wave of whispering behind her brought her out of the frozen stupor, and she was all teacher, dismissing the child with, "All right, Ruth Jean." So, Hal was coming home. Ruth Jean could not know that Hal Denning was the romantic reason that Miss Marsh had not yet married, the reason that she could not quite bring herself to marry good, substantial Dr. MacDonald, even though he was offering her one of the nicest homes in Mayville. That whenever she had almost persuaded herself to take the step, it was the memory of that wicked grin of Hal's, intruding itself, or the twinkle of his eyes, or any one of a dozen lovable characteristics that kept her from it. Unfortunately, One may not happily mate with Asclepius if she had known Piaru. It is no less than miraculous how the human mind can divide itself into two compartments. The teacher, Miss Marsh, living on the ground floor of her mental apartment house, so to speak, now conducted a very creditable reading class with no perceptible diminishing of her constant oversight of the lesson. You may take the part of Peacock, Marion, the part of the duck, Joe, while the girl, Judith Marsh, inhabiting the upper apartment, simultaneously talking with Hal Denning, walking with him, rode with him, went up the river with him, saw him in his grandmother Denning's house as a big gangling boy in Mayville, long before he had become nationally known. I do not see why you strut so. Masculinity was floundering. Because I am proud of my fine feathers, the deadlier of the species read glibly. You may go on from there, Ruth Jean and Edgar. And while the peacock swaggered and the duck threw the cold water of a stupid philosophy upon his gay happiness, Judith recalled many things. She remembered little grandmother Denning, whose one endeavor in life seemed to have been to bring up Hal so he would miss neither his mother nor his father, who had been her only boy. And Grandma Denning's hands apparently had been full, for Hal was constantly dipping into all the small town's mischief-making. And incidentally, he had thoroughly decorated that town with chalk and pencil. High-board fences, woodsheds, and sidewalks bore his imprint. School books introduced to snickering onlookers a rakish Columbus sailing unknown seas in a bathtub. A silly-looking Benjamin Franklin knocked into ludicrous insensibility by his lightning. Foppish Indians calling out ridiculous questions to a pertly torting bunch of pilgrims. The bottom of Grandma Denning's dresser drawers, her cupboard drawers, the whitewashed cellarway, from all of them those absurd figures of Hal's had looked at one with their foolish sayings billowing out from grotesque mouths in elliptical-shaped pencilings. Grandma had endured them all until the day she found the caricature of a terrible tramp-like person in those bold strokes embellishing the freshness of her newly pasted kitchen wallpaper. Hal must have been larger than Grandma by that time, but size or no size, in her indignation she had given him a sound thrashing, but admitted she had merely cried a little and laughed a little the next day, when across from the tramp she found a companion piece of an abnormally diminutive person who was herself, and over her knees an exaggeratedly large boy, whose long legs trailed out across the picture with "Wah! Wah!" in that balloon-shaped flourish of pencil coming from his cavernous mouth. In the clarity of the recollection, Judith smiled, and the children, thinking she was overcome by the antics of the duck and the peacock, all laughed immoderately. The last page, Edgar and May. Well, to Grandma's prideful relief and perhaps her ever-wondering surprise, Hal, instead of turning out to be a nitwit, had turned out to be a genius, and at least in the eyes of Mayville, rather rich. For the great American public, liking nothing so much as to have its risibilities tickled, pays its clowns more than its statesmen. And as though in reparation for all his trouble to her, Hal had later given Grandma everything her heart could wish, everything except her youth. So all through the afternoon it went, like the sound of music through the monotonous reciting and reading and writing in study halls. Hal was coming. Hal was to spend 2 days with his boyhood friends, Joe and Mabel, who in the old days had made up the foursome with Hal and herself. He had been back only twice before in all those years. That last time, all the walks and talks, she had thought, but he had gone away with all that might have been said, unsaid. Looking out through the window now, she could see the backyard behind Joe and Mabel's pretty brick house, the low white fence and the last of the season's garden chrysanthemums. A suit of Joe's on the line turned and whirled and flapped its leaves in the autumn wind, as though Joe were inside and dancing about in an ecstasy of gladness that his old chum was coming home. She wondered what Saturday and Sunday would be like. hoped that they would be lovely so the four of them could turn back the clock and go picnicking up the river just as of old. Mabel's mother would look after Ruth Jean and the baby at her home. Everything would be just as it used to be. The scarlet oaks, the old log cabin for lunching, the river running its lazy way to the sea, Joe and Mabel, and she and Hal. Nothing would be different. All afternoon her heart sang a little song of thanksgiving that was both solemn and merry. It was dismissal time now, and the pupils were passing out with complete and ironic reversal of their entry, the boys enthusiastically and the girls half reluctant to leave. Ruth Jean stepped out of the line because of the weighty things she wanted to tell Miss Marsh. "Miss Marsh, I have to hurry home and help Mother." She had that little girl's importance of helping, which becomes quite lost a few years later. "Mother's got to do a lot before our company comes from New York. Mother says coming from New York that way, they will be used to everything nice." "They?" said Judith weakly. "Oh, yes, Miss March. I forgot to tell you. He said in his letter there'd be a young lady with him from New York. Her name is Grace." She came close to Judith, raised herself up on her toes, and whispered through her fat little hands, "His girl, Mother says." "I see. Good night, Miss Marsh." "Good night, children." "No, Mark, you don't need to stay today. I'll erase the board myself this time. Thank you." Judith slipped back into her room and closed the door, tried with all of her strength to close it in on the sweetness of the memories in which she had reveled that afternoon. But it would not shut them out. Oh, why was he coming? To have buried your heart and to have tried to forget where the grave was, and then at a piece of news to run right to the spot and begin frantically digging it up, only to find it all red and alive and palpitating. It wasn't fair. If he had stayed away, he and his Grace, where he belonged, why, only recently she had begun to think that perhaps, after all, good, steady Dr. MacDonald. The wind blew around the schoolhouse. Leaves whirled and spiraled, as foolishly active as her memories. For a long time she sat idly at the desk until Emil, the janitor, still grimy from the coal, came in and deposited an assortment of jangling pails, mops, and brooms, so that she mechanically took down her hat and coat and started for home. Tonight she would not stop at Mabel's. On second thought, better to run in for a few moments, face the music, and get it over. Thanks to her own poise and self-control, they did not know that she still cared. Thought her interest in Dr. MacDonald growing as they had begun to accept the fact that the affair was serious. "Oh, hello, Judy. Did Ruth Jean tell you the news?" Mabel was trying to take off the baby's coat while he bounced up and down like an animated pump handle. "Yes, isn't it fine?" Judith was proud of her straightforward look. "He's driving through, going on to Hollywood, something about screening some of his stuff. Doesn't that sound important? And," she bent over the baby, "bringing his girl. My word, Judy, can you imagine your mother or mine letting us drive across the country with our bows, engaged or not engaged?" "I should say not. Proof that we're outmoded, Mabel." She was as cool as she could have wished. Ruth Jean fixed the two with her solemn round eyes. "Maybe," said the little oracle, "she's got married to him by this time." "Maybe she has," they both laughed. Judith rose to go, but stopped at hearing Joe come into the driveway. She would wait to see Joe, too, just for a minute. She felt strong, now that the first ice was broken. She would be all right permanently. "Hello, Judy." "Hello, Joe." How poised she was. "Hear about Hal?" "Yes, isn't it lovely?" Mabel separated the baby's mouth and one of the chair's tassels. "Joe and I sort of sketchily planned this noon just what we'd do for them. We think on account of their driving in that way, sometime in the afternoon of Saturday, we'll just have a small dinner for 6 or 8 of us. Then on Sunday, we'll get Father's bigger car and all drive to Millard to dine at the Chief. Maybe Hal might want to make a few calls over there where his mother's people used to live. Then Sunday night, we'll have an informal buffet dinner, here with perhaps 20, as many of the old crowd as we can scrape together anyway, and a few of the newer people would like to meet him. He's leaving early Monday morning, he says. About the small dinner, Judy, shall we have Dr. MacDonald for you? No, said Judith in a frantic refusal. Oh, no. And it had happened. With no control of her emotions, the thing was said. With words no more important than those simple ones, she had done the damage. It was as though a curtain had been pulled aside and she stood naked and ashamed before her two best friends. Pink and embarrassed and sick with distress, she knew that they had suddenly seen what she had intended no one to see, merely by saying she could not come to dinner for Hal with Dr. MacDonald. For years she had laughed with Joe and Mabel at Hal's foolery in the papers, saved comic strips for them, which they might have missed, discussed freely his rise to popularity, lived the constant pretense that he was nothing more to her than a good friend of the old days. And now this. Oh, well, Mabel set the baby down and said quickly to fill the embarrassing gap. I tell you, we'll just wait a day or so to see what our plans are, for sure, whether we'll do that way or... Her voice trailed off vaguely, and Judy went home sick with the hurt in her heart and the wound to her pride. At home, she had told her father and mother with elaborately assumed cheerfulness that Hal Denning was coming home and bringing his girl, at which her father launched into a chuckling tale of reminiscences involving the youthful Hal and some contraband watermelons. But with the uncanny knowledge of mothers, Mrs. Marsh kept a discreet and suspicious silence. During dinner, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Clement Waldo Stryker, and she was summoning Judith to a called meeting of the division heads of the Mayville Community Ladies Welfare Club. This meeting was to be held at 8:30 at her home, and the dictum was absolute. Mrs. Clement Waldo Stryker was the mayor's wife, old Clem having held office for 12 years and bidding fair to hold it another dozen, for one went right on voting for him term after term, realizing that one's ballot was not so much for old Clem as it was vicariously cast for his wife. Mrs. Stryker was the head of so many of Mayville's organizations that, in truth, if Hercules had appeared in Mayville and cut off one of them, a good old mythological fashion, two new organizations would have appeared to take its place, and both heads would have been Mrs. Clement Waldo Stryker. It seemed now that Mrs. Stryker had just learned of the coming visit to Mayville of Hal Denning, and half incensed at the 6 hours' delay in being apprised of it, had forthwith decided that there should be a welcoming dinner for him at 7 o'clock on Saturday night at the new community building. As she elucidated over the wires, there the new building stood, all completed, so that it seemed as if Providence had taken a hand and sent them Mayville's distinguished son, just in time to introduce the two to each other as the populace looked on. In vain, Judith began an explanation that Hal was to be Joe and Mabel's guest, that they were planning a small dinner party, that he was bringing a girlfriend, so the time did not seem auspicious. It fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Stryker was the official greeter of the town, and on this particular occasion held no intention of allowing her place to be usurped. Judith went stubbornly to the committee meeting. It seemed so silly to have a dinner of that type, so small-townish. If Hal were coming alone... But the girl, what would she think? The best they could do would be of one of those hospitable, noisy village demonstrations. A dozen women in Mayville could have given a very creditable little dinner that would not have been glaringly defective from a social standpoint. They were not all backwoodsy, but a huge conglomerate gathering... It was a horrible thing to perpetrate on Hal and the girl. She began to see everything through the eyes of the strange girl who was coming with him, and the metamorphosis was not pleasant to contemplate. The Mayville Community Ladies Welfare Club was divided, through the chief's army-like leadership, into 4 divisions, each headed by a chairman and Mrs. Stryker, and the greatest of these was Mrs. Stryker. The four were Mrs. Otto Schneiderman, Mrs. Hattie Durkin, Mrs. Ralph Hitchcock, and Judith. Judith was the last of these to arrive, for she had taken time to go around by Mabel's and tell her what Mrs. Stryker was putting across willy-nilly. Mabel had capitulated, as one must before the Madams Strikers of the world. Had said that she didn't want to be selfish, and if Mrs. Stryker really felt that Hal should be given some kind of ovation by the town. Yours not to wonder why, yours but to do or die. Judith had congratulated herself on her self-possession. Perhaps by adhering strictly to this renewed poise, she could counteract any impression she might have given Joe and Mabel earlier in the day. As she mounted the stairs to remove her wraps in Mrs. Stryker's guest chamber, she could hear the other ladies in conversation, specifically the voice of Mrs. Hattie Durkin, remarking acridly, "Embarrassing to be an old girl he ditched." "Hold on to yourself, Judith," she said under her breath. "Consider the source." For Mrs. Hattie Durkin, head of Division 2, was the town's human flea. Not a wasp whose sting is formidable, but a mere flea, which is a wingless, blood-sucking creature with extraordinary powers of leaping. From one person to another, Mrs. Hattie Durkin darted, sticking her tiny proboscis of gossip into one, piercing the outer texture of his sensibilities, while her thin lips smiled and her small beady eyes shifted cannily toward her prey. "Oh, hello, Judith," she said now. "You'll be glad to see Hal. You were such old friends." Then she bit Mrs. Ralph Hitchcock, whose husband's business had failed. "Hal will see changes in your life, Ada." And she enjoyed the victim's momentary irritation at the puncture. They all went downstairs to begin plans for an event which Judith loathed with every fiber of her being. Mrs. Stryker, having figuratively donned her general's uniform upon first hearing of Hal's coming, was ready with her bombardment. She made her assignments immediately. Mrs. Otto Schneiderman was to have charge of the food, a very sanguine procedure, for Mrs. Schneiderman's theory of life was that earth held no sorrow that food could not heal. Her motto, "A bird on the table is worth two in the hen house." Her prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." It contained no spiritual interpretation. So she came like a war horse to the battle of menu. One would have thought to hear her talk that Hal had never known a square meal since he shook the dust of Mayville from his nimble feet. She was all for vegetable soup, chicken pie, noodles, oysters, roast beef, rolls, cabbage salad, fruit salad. Judith looked at her through the eyes of the girl who was coming. She seemed to be able to visualize that girl, dark and tall and slender, and the last word in modish attire. She could imagine her soft smile, guarded but supercilious, hear her laugh with Hal later. She could bear anything better than to think that Hal would laugh with her. Mrs. Otto Schneiderman was concerned with the food to be consumed. Mrs. Ralph Hitchcock was torn by social problems, where Hal should sit, where the toastmaster, the girl, the order in which speakers and singers should be honored in the seating problem. Would the Reverend Arthur Caldwell be heard if the Reverend Benjamin Haas were asked to give the invocation? Should the girl have a corsage at her plate? "After all," said Mrs. Stryker pompously, "the dinner is for Hal. We really don't know the status of the girl." Mrs. Hattie Durkin immediately lighted and bit. "Good land, he's engaged to her, or he wouldn't have brung her," and darted her small, beady eyes at Judith. She hated it all, did Judith, the deep discussions over trifles, whether to put raisins in the dark cakes or leave them out, whether to have the salad placed fresh on the plates, as Mrs. Schneiderman wanted it, or embalmed in gelatin, as Mrs. Stryker insisted. Eventually, all four, however, were assigned to their respective posts. Mrs. Otto Schneiderman for food, Mrs. Ralph Hitchcock for the program, Mrs. Hattie Durkin for publicity, tickets, and finances, and Judith for tables, dishes, and decorations. with Mrs. Clement Waldo Stryker, in the language of Mr. Kipling, as he correctly, if unintentionally, described her, sitting up in the conning tower, bossing 300 men. Out of a chaos of plans and suggestions, ludicrous, feasible, and impossible, there slowly and painfully evolved a program for the occasion. She, who can handle a small-town community affair, could be ambassador to the court of St. James. Tickets were to be sold to the public. He belongs to every man, woman, and child in the community, Mrs. Hitchcock had said, with ready emotional moisture in her eyes. Mrs. Hattie Durkin had leaped. "I'd say he belongs to his girl," she cackled, and then shot Judith a furtive glance. The dinner was to be at 7, or as nearly afterwards as it was possible for Mayville's beauty and chivalry to assemble. The high school orchestra was to play. The Reverend Benjamin Haas was to give an invocation before they were seated. Although it took physical bravery and a goodly portion of tact, Mrs. Otto Schneiderman was to be held down to 3 courses of food. Mrs. Walter Merrick, who had studied music in Chicago, was to sing "to render," sometimes meaning to inflict. The Methodist Men's Quartet was to render a piece. Hannah Thompson Emmett was to read an original poem. Mayor Stryker was to make the official welcoming speech on behalf of the town. Joe Edmonston was to give an expurgated summary of Hal's boyhood, after which resume and appropriately, as atonement follows confession of past sins, the Reverend Arthur Caldwell was to pay tribute to Hal's latter and supposedly less lurid life. This assortment of literary, musical, and spiritual contributions to Hal Denning's welcome was good as far as it went. But to Mrs. Hitchcock's emotional nature, it did not go far enough. As I said before, her sensitive chin quivered in comradely alliance with her warm heart, Hal Denning belongs to every man, woman, and child in the community. And I repeat, child. But notice that up to this minute, not one of the little darlings has a part in the program. I want the little folks to have a share in this welcome, too. Judith, couldn't you train a group, some little flag drill or something of that kind? No, I couldn't, said Judith, and cast about wildly for an excuse that would not wobble too noticeably. We're beginning a new and hard number work on Monday, and I always make a good deal of preparation for it. And inasmuch as none of the other 4 had ever taught, the frail little excuse limped past them without reproach. Oh, she hated it all. If it were Hal alone, but the girl, it would be a ridiculous thing for her to witness. Why should these good, kind people, salt of the earth, as the Reverend Caldwell called them, work their heads off for 3 days to welcome Hal home, only to be laughed at for their pains? Yesterday she had loved all these home folks. Well, almost all of them. Tonight she hated them for proposing and expecting to carry out this wild small-town festivity, this village orgy, this wineless bacchanalia. But it was always of the girl she was thinking. Hal would fit in anywhere. But that rag and bone and hank of hair who was coming with him? How could she understand the love and affection for Hal that was going into this ridiculous dinner? Hal alone would understand, but Hal was not to be alone. Men are so susceptible to the opinions of the girls with whom they were in love. And Hal was in love. Thursday and Friday were lived through. On Friday afternoon, Judith went to the woods with the school children for autumn leaves with which to decorate the freshly plastered sides of the new barn-like room called, by courtesy, the banquet hall. Saturday dawned, mild and warm and sunshiny. October's Indian summer was welcoming Hal, too, with the haze in the distance that he loved and the smell of fall-turned loam and wild haws and bonfires coming over the town on the wings of the autumn breeze. Just before noon, Judith made her angel food cake, a huge 15-egg affair that, in its completed white perfection, soothed her pride for the space of a few moments. In the early afternoon, she went down to the community building and set her tables. At home again, she bathed, then dressed for evening in a soft gray-blue mull, the exact shade of her eyes. At 5 o'clock, she took her cake in its basket and started back to the community building. Because there was no car at Joe and Mabel's, she stopped for a brief moment, half in fear that the couple would come before she could get away. She found Mabel tired and irritable with the nervousness that comes from preparing to entertain a stranger. Ruth Jean was practicing monotonously. 1, 2, 1, 2. The baby was nibbling a piece of paraffin, so Judith extracted it from his mouth and cuddled him for a few moments. She may not like children, she thought, and for no special reason had a fleeting hope that she would not. All the way down to dinner, she looked at the town through the coming stranger's eyes. The small park with its simple little fountain. Once she had been so proud of that newly acquired fountain. The wide country lane streets with the trees nearly meeting overhead. Once she had reveled in their soothing shade. The hodgepodge homes, square frames, bungalows, cottages, red brick two-storied ones. Once they had looked pleasant and adequate because they housed old friends. The community building itself, now a huge gray stucco affair, its architecture merely inverted soup tureen. Once she had worked hard for that building, given school programs to earn money for it, been proud of its completion. Today she saw nothing but through alien eyes, and a small Midwestern town through alien eyes is sometimes not a lovely thing. She went up to the walk to the south door. Box elder bugs swarmed over the whole side, the warmth of the Indian summer day having brought them out of their fall hibernation. They clung to the gray of the stucco like an army of reds carrying their flags under each wing. They irritated her, as though they too were merely small-town bugs, as though city bugs might have flaunted more modest colors, been better behaved. She went directly into the kitchen with its new pine built-in tables and sinks. The room seemed too warm with the heat from the range, so she took her cake on into the far end of the cool plastered furnace room and placed it on a shelf near a partly open window, covering it securely with a snow-white tea towel. Back in the kitchen, she encountered Mrs. Clement Waldo Stryker. Her portly figure encased in black satin, jet earrings against the pink smoothness of her fat cheeks. Just now a huge apron swathed the satin dress. How grotesque! How the girl would laugh at the combination. Where, besides in a small town, did one ever encounter such an occasion of servant and hostess ideas and clothes? Mrs. Hattie Durkin came in. She darted a swift glance at Judith with her little shifting eyes. "Judith, you and Hal were such old friends. You should have et with him instead of working." Judith felt the bite, pretended it hadn't stung, and said casually, "Oh, somebody always has to put over a social affair." The helpers were arriving, the 2 women hired to pare potatoes. Everything was so confusing in the kitchen that Judith slipped into the large dining room, where her tables stretched their forms down the room like block-lawn white sheeted panels. The tablecloths were of a dozen varied patterns. Mrs. Schneiderman's Irish damask ones overlapped Mrs. Hattie Durkin's mercerized ones. The flowers were homegrown, the vases a heterogeneous collection borrowed from high and low. All the leaves that the children had brought could not hide the bareness of the newly plastered walls. There were not anywhere enough new chairs for the crowd, and now the high school boys were noisily stumbling in with a jumble of drugstore chairs, funeral parlor chairs, Mrs. Merrick's early American, Mrs. Stryker's modern Jacobean, and Mrs. Hattie Durkin's painted kitchen ones. The high school girls who were to wait on tables arrived in 15-year-old breathless excitement over the coming of the romantic couple. Judith fixed salads, a million little quivering pyramids of pale green gelatin arose from their pale green lettuce beds, giving specific proof that Mrs. Stryker still wielded her scepter, had won in the salad argument. That majestic personage was now engaged in giving everyone orders. "As soon as I give the signal, start in to arrange the second course. As soon as the second course is being removed, start cutting cakes. It must all go off like clockwork. Judith had a wild notion that the whole affair was being conducted from the trenches, that this was just before the 0 hour, and soon they were all to go over the top. How she would have loved to laugh about it with Hal, imitate Mrs. Stryker's bombastic orders and Mrs. Schneiderman's perturbation over the amount of provender. She could see the way Hal's mouth would be drawn up at the corners and the wicked grin give way to contagious chuckles. Oh, would the girl have a sense of that same deep humor, understand that delicious whimsy? It was nearly time now. People were in the parlors, freshly plastered and decorated with the autumn leaves and the GAR, Spanish American, and World War flags. She could hear laughing, talking, through the constant swinging doors, catch glimpses of the town's merchants and professional men, farmers and laborers, a cosmopolitan group of men, and such wives, sisters, and daughters as were not actively engaged in the food belt. 3 high school girls stuck their heads through 3 swinging doors simultaneously to shrill, "They're here!" The members of the Mayville Community Ladies Welcome Club forgot their cues, ignored their field marshal, and crowded to the swinging doors to peek at the guest of honor and his young lady. Madams Durkin, Schneiderman, and Hitchcock all went out to shake hands with the returning hero and his sweetheart, headed by no less a personage than their bellwether, Mrs. Clement Waldo Stryker. Judith knew she should have trailed along too, but she could not with the eyes of the town upon her. She had been a traitor to herself at Joe and Mabel's, and now she could not trust the unreliable person she had thought to be her placid self. It seemed suffocating here in the kitchen. In the few minutes she would be all right, but just now her heart was pounding so hard that its noise was in her ears. The pulsation of her throat was so apparent that she put her hand there to still its beating. Suddenly she turned and slipped into the cool quiet of the furnace room, colliding as she did so with Joe, who had just deposited an ice cream freezer therein. "Oh, Joe, sorry," she said, and finished lamely, "I have to see about my cake." And then, to fool herself, pretending to herself to prove her point, she walked over to the far end of the room where the cake sat, to unveil its white perfection, and stared. Some 400 box elderbugs were toiling their way patiently up the treacherous iced sides, like so many hardy alpine climbers. Several dozen, having gained their objective, peered out from frosted crevices at the top. The gayest adventurers of them all, a few clumsy fellows, flew flappingly up from their highly original investigation of the dark shaft of the center hole. From the open window, a long line of happy fellow soldiers of fortune were hurrying cakeward. It seemed the last straw on a breaking camel, the paramount horror of a hideous nightmare, the final drop of a 3-day deluge of small-town stuff. She clenched her fists in her nervousness. Angry tears came to her eyes so that she pinched her tongue with her teeth to keep back the hysteria. She was ashamed of Mayville, ashamed of everyone in it and everything they did. She was going to slip out of that far outside door and leave Because she heard a door open behind her and saw a shaft of light, she turned. "Hal? Judy! How did you? Joe told me you were in here, crawling into the furnace." After a lifetime of longing for him, years of dreaming it all out, days of the anticipation of meeting him again, all she could think to say was, "Oh, Hal, my cake's ruined with 1,000 box elderbugs." Thus do we meet life's deepest crises. "What's a bug or two between friends, Judy?" Hal was grinning in that never-to-be-forgotten way, with the corners of his mouth drawing up and holding out his arms. Before she could think, before reason had time to command, and only foolish sentiment directed, she was in his arms, and Hal had held her close and kissed her. Like a flower to the sun or the tides to the moon, she had gone before she remembered how or why she had let herself go. After all, Hal was modern, probably kissed indiscriminately these days if he chose. She had always been a little old-fashioned about it. Well, she still was. More small-town stuff maybe, but it was the way she felt. "Oh, Hal, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, nor let you." "And why not Judy Prudy?" It was the first time she had heard that old nickname for years. "Well, the girl." She was laughing in embarrassment. After all, she shouldn't attach any importance to the very natural thing of that friendly greeting, except for the fact that it had seemed so much more than friendly. "The girl? What girl? Whose girl? Why a girl?" "Why, the girl you brought." She looked up at Hal, startled. "You did bring her, didn't you?" Hal threw back his head and laughed long and merrily behind the furnace in the plaster-smelling room. "My girl's 81. Grandma. I told Joe I was bringing her, but it seems that my penmanship isn't all that it might be. And in my hastily scribbled note, the word Gran looked like Grace. And Joe and Mabel were all set to welcome a real fiancé. You should have seen their faces when I helped little old Gran out of the car." Then he pulled Judith close again. "Lord, Judy, you're sweet and dear. I don't know why we've wasted any," he broke off to say hurriedly. "I'm dropping Grandma off here to visit, and I'm taking you on to the coast with me. Will you, Judy? Marry me before Monday morning and drive on to the coast with me?" And without waiting for an answer, "How do you get married around here anyway? Do you have to tack up a notice in the post office? Or does old Preacher Haas announce it from the pulpit along with prayer meeting and choir practice? I get married so seldom these days." Judy was laughing. Was she always to laugh now? "Oh, Hal, I couldn't." For the first time he was serious. "There's no one else? None of these new men? If there is..." "No, there never has been anybody but you. Dr. MacDonald might have been in Tasmania." "But I mean it, not Monday. Why, I couldn't. I'm a teacher. We're taking up new number work Monday morning." "So am I. I'm subtracting Grandma and adding you and dividing my income," and Hal would. "And we'll talk about multiplying later." Joe opened a door, stuck his head around the furnace, and emitted an ancient small-town joke. "Hey, folks, sorry to interrupt, but we can't start things out here without the prodigal calf." And Hal had to go. He kept Judy's hand a moment, kissed the soft pink palms. "Are you coming in to sit with me?" "Heavens, no! Hal, go on, hurry. I'm chairman of Division 4 of the Mayville Ladies Community Welfare Club." "My word," he said, "and to think I once glimpsed the Sultan of Turkey." And Hal was gone. And Judith, her heart shouting to the four winds that she was going away with Hal, had to go back into the kitchen to hand out quivering green gelatin pyramids through an aperture in the wall. The kitchen was now a mass of moving, hurrying, perspiring members of the Ladies' Community Welfare Club, obeying the orders of their chief. When the last of the second course had gone the way of the opening in the wall, the order was to start on the cakes. Judith cut a layer cake of mulatto hue, chocolate-filled and chocolate-covered. Mrs. Hattie Durkin next to her cut an albino-complexioned one of lemon origin. "My, how swell, isn't he?" She was opening her wedge. "And did you hear it was only Grandma Denning he brought?" "Yes, oh yes," said Judith, so very, very happy that it was only Grandma Denning he had brought. Mrs. Hattie Durkin prepared to light. "But he's going to get married, though. Pa asked him, and he laughed and told Pa soon. And Pa just had time to tell me when I was coming back in." "Yes, so I heard too," replied Judy. Having lit, Mrs. Hattie Durkin prepared to bite. "You're hardly good enough friends with Hal now, I suppose?" She darted her little eyes sideways toward Judith. To know who she is? I've been wondering who he's going to marry." She did not care especially who the girl was. She merely wanted to puncture human skin as she hopped lightly from one person to another. "You wouldn't know, I suppose." "Yes," said Judy, sweetly confidential. "They say an old girl of his that he wants ditched." And she sawed away serenely on a tough, if bugless, cake. The swinging doors to the banquet hall opened and shut constantly like the doors to heaven, and Judith knew herself to be a Peri, one of those elves of Parisian myth, excluded from paradise until they had paid penance. And the penance was abject humility before the god of friendships because of disloyalty to her own. Through those swinging portals she could hear the Reverend Benjamin Haas praying for Hal's immortal soul. Hal, who had given clean and wholesome joy to the nation. She could hear Mayor Stryker welcome Hal home and give him the key to the city. Hal, whose inquisitive nose had poked itself into every culvert and cranny of the village before he was 10. She could hear them laugh uproariously at Joe's homely expose of Hal's checkered boyhood career, and hear the Reverend Arthur Caldwell smooth it over so the Lord would not take Joe's report seriously and think too ill of Hal. She could see a long, unfurled manuscript in the hands of Hannah Thompson Emmett and guess at the literary value of the homegrown poem. She could catch glimpses of little old Grandma Denning beaming with pride as though to say, "Just look at the man I paddled him up to be." She could hear the high school orchestra, rather top-heavy as to brass, could hear Mrs. Walter Merrick sing in her best Chicago voice, home again from a foreign shore," and the slightly discordant but lusty Methodist quartet render, "There's no place like home." Her work done, she stepped through the swinging door in time to see Mrs. Ralph Hitchcock's little darlings welcome home Mayville's distinguished son in their own blithe way. Mrs. Hitchcock, with emotional moisture in her eyes and much after-school practice, had trained a group of kindergartners to go through a little drill, at the close of which they were, with startling surprise, to form suddenly, with lettered cards held high above their heads, the touching tribute, "Welcome home, Hal." In her most enthusiastically hopeful moment, Mrs. Hitchcock had underestimated both the startling nature of the procedure and the efficacy of the surprise. Measles having somewhat disrupted the young cast during the practice, and substitutes at late hour having taken the places of a few of the original cast, there was now, as the drill was ending, a bit of confusion in the assembling of the component parts of the surprise greeting. A few of the late recruits, including the exclamation point and the comma, who had not rehearsed at all, becoming confused concerning their respective positions and fearful of being left out altogether, were elbowing, not to say fighting their way into the display with more zeal than discrimination. For suddenly, to Mrs. Hitchcock's red-faced mortification and the company's raucous hilarity, the greeting stood forth in all the simplicity of its hospitable invitation. "All hell, come home." Judith laughed with the others until she cried. Hal was shouting like a schoolboy. The effect was disrupting to whatever shreds of formality might have clung to the event. Happily, it was the last thing on the program, for no other participant could have been taken seriously. Chairs were pushed back, modern Jacobean, early American, the funeral parlor ones and the soda fountain ones and the yellow-painted ones. People were crowding around Hal, shaking hands with him, laughing, adding their own extemporaneous speeches to Joe's summary of anecdotes concerning the town's prize mischief maker. A sort of jovial pandemonium reigned supreme. The kindergartners, released from their devastating responsibility of welcoming the hometown boy who made good, were trying their hands and mouths at the various deserted orchestra instruments, with ear-splitting results. All but the exclamation point and the comma, who were finishing the leftover ice cream. In their patrician way, the Irish damask tablecloths were as guilty of being awry as the mercerized ones. Crumbs of homemade cake lay soggily in green puddles that had once jauntily looked the world in the eye as salad pyramids. 1,000 dirty dishes awaited washing by a tired membership of the Ladies' Community Welfare Club. A box elder bug in a jolly explorative mood sailed back and forth across the scene, piloting his red-painted airplane impartially from table to table. It was all small-town stuff put on by small-town people in a small-town way, but Judith, whose heart was singing, felt only a warmth of affection toward them all. Hal would understand the sincerity and kindliness that had prompted the whole event. Only a strange girl with critical alien eyes would not be able to understand. And there was no strange girl with critical alien eyes. Just Judith Marsh with tender, love-filled ones.